Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm standing here along Galveston Bay where I'm next to the location of the largest industrial accident in the U.S. history, and that is the Texas City disaster that happened in April of 1947. So come join me today. Let's learn about this really unique event and unfortunate event that took place here along the coast of Texas. Let's get to it. Here's a nice map to show you where Texas City sits relative to Houston. So here's Houston, Texas. So I can zoom out for people. There's Austin and San Antonio. And down here is Texas City, just across from Galveston. So you'll see Galveston's a pretty well-known ocean or beach town. A lot of people go and hang out and spend time on the beach here. And Texas City's just on the other side of the bay that separates Galveston from the mainland. And Texas City sits here. And this is one of the reasons it was such an important port city from early on, back in the 1800s, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and of course that would help set up the disaster that took place here. Right where you see this barge pulling in is the area where the Texas City disaster took place. And you'll see it's still a very busy port today. So for us to learn a little bit more about the Texas City disaster and about Texas City itself, let's go head down to the Texas City Museum. So that's a regional museum here, and see what we can learn about the founding of the town, about the history in this area, and more about the Texas City disaster. So we're going to go ahead and start our tour of Texas City here at the Texas City Museum. I thought this would be a good place for us to learn a little bit more about this disaster and a little bit more about the city where it took place at. Now, this building behind me is actually the old J.C. Penney building, which for me has some family history in the sense that my grandmother actually worked at J.C. Penney and actually retired from there. So as I walk in, you'll see that it's open Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it looks like there's a train exhibit open each Saturday, and I'm here on a Saturday. Be excited to check out that train exhibit as well. There is an admission, so adults are $7, seniors are $5, college student or military are $5, and youth 7 to 17 are $4, and children under 6 years of age are free. And I'll say when I walk in, this is a really impressive looking museum and not what I expected when I was walking in or walking up to this place from the outside. To start learning a little bit about the history of Texas City and the disaster, we need to talk about how it was founded and some famous individuals that were here, including Privateer James Campbell, who was a privateer, aka a pirate, that sailed with Jean Lafitte. James Campbell set up a farm and lived out the rest of his life here in southern Texas City. It was probably one of the earliest Europeans to live in this area. Pre the European settlers coming in here, like Jean Lafitte and James Campbell, you actually had the Cronqua Indians, or indigenous people that lived along the coast here. And these are some images of them. Now, I don't think there's any of these indigenous people left in the area. I believe they ended up moving to the south and eventually ending up moving in with other indigenous tribes down in Mexico. But if anybody knows more about that story, feel free, please, to add comments down below so we can all learn. Why was 1893 an important time? Well, that's when they actually suggest Texas City, or is recorded that Texas City was established. So pre-1893, individuals lived in this area, both indigenous people as well as Europeans and others, and eventually they ended up making this into the city in 1893. There's a lot of history to see here in the museum, including the 1st Aero Squadron, or the 1st Air Force Corps, and it was based here in Texas City. Pretty unique history. Because of its location in the Bay of Houston, or Galveston Bay, this ended up being a place for industrial expansion. Now, you had the military here, mentioned the 1st Aero Squad just a minute ago, as well as you had trains coming through this area, you had shipping, and so this became a major port in this area, and especially during World War II, This became a pretty significant port for shipping supplies over to Europe. And here's a little bit more about that. So during World War II, the growth of Texas City, it had refineries producing gasoline and oil and aviation fuels and heating fuels, all things they needed for the war effort. And I didn't realize this was the home to North America's only tin smelter. And of course, tin was used in a number of machines. And there were some famous war heroes from this area. Archie Donahue, who was basically a World War ace. They actually called him a triple ace pilot because he shot down 15 Japanese warplanes in the Pacific. Unfortunately, he was actually flying a plane over Texas City on April 16th, 1947, when the Texas City disaster happened, and he was one of the two planes. He was in one of the two planes that was destroyed while in the air because of that. Wild. The other hometown hero here was Thomas Jones Gary, who was serving on the USS California on December 7th, 1941, and he ended up rescuing 3 or 4 wounded people from burning compartments in the ship. But as he continued to save others from the battleship, he eventually lost his own life, and in honor, they named a destroyer escort after him, and he was a Texas City native. Now we come to the portion of the museum that talks about the real reason why I wanted to come down here to Texas City, and that was to learn more about what would be the largest industrial accident in U.S. history, the Texas City disaster. So on the morning of April 16th, 1947, the Grand Camp ship that we can see here was carrying ammonium nitrate, which is known to be combustible, and a fire started in the hull. And instead of using water to put out the fire, the captain ordered steam to be used because he didn't want to ruin the rest of the cargo in there, including things like cotton and tobacco and peanuts and some munitions. Well, it was a tragic mistake because the pressure would get too great. The ammonium nitrate would eventually ignite and basically created a large size bomb. The Grand Camp would eventually be totally destroyed, and here's a little bit more information about that. And the SS Grand Camp was the first to catch fire, but then there was a ship next door to it called the High Flyer that also caught fire, also carrying ammonium nitrate and sulfur that would eventually cause a second explosion. So you ended up having 2 explosions the size of a large bomb going off in this port city. And here's the lay of what that looked like. Here's the coastal front. Here is the wharf area. The Grand Camp and High Flyer were sitting in this area docked. And after the explosion, you can see it was quite the industrial area, including oil tankers or oil tanks and propane tanks. And when it exploded, it leveled everything. You can see the sugar refinery, where there's a number of individuals working there lost their lives. There were homes that were lined up against this area that were flattened and no longer exist. And they were able to feel the force of this explosion miles and miles away. In fact, it was actually picked up on a seismograph in Denver. It blew out windows and it dropped people to their knees in a large radius. And here's more about the aftermath. Killed about 600 people. Some of those were never identified, and we're going to go visit the memorial later on that was set up for those who were not identified. But as you can imagine, it was a port city. There were probably a number of people who didn't have their information captured, or they didn't even know they were there, or they were just coming through, transporting from one place to another. So they think the toll is much higher than even 600 people. You'll see here that 5,000 people were injured, and the entire firefighter crew that first showed up to work on the Grand Camp. In fact, this is that crew. This is the last known evidence of them. They were standing right next to the Grand Camp where they were spraying water on trying to control the fire when that explosion occurred. And of course, they never found their remains. There was only one firefighter from this volunteer firefighter group who survived. There were reports that it was as devastating as places that many of the soldiers and many of the people that were living here had recently come back from either the Pacific Theater or the European Theater serving during World War II, and many described it as worse than any of the scenes that they saw during the war. With over 5,000 people injured and over 600 dead, you can just imagine the type of effect it had on the community. Not only from an emotional, but as well as from a physical point of view, because many lost their homes and livelihoods as well. Here are articles they collected from the disaster: a pair of safety goggles, a watch missing its chain that's charred, a shoe. Here's a clock from City Hall in Texas City, and you'll see where the time stopped. And now it's all charred and beaten up. Stopped April 16th, 1947. And here is a piece of shrapnel from one of the ships. Now I'm wondering if they weren't able to identify it, so it's either the High Flyer or the Grand Camp. Debris flew for miles. In fact, one of the anchors actually flew 1.6 miles away from where the ship was originally moored. And here are many more photos showing the destruction from that explosion. And here's some twine that was stored in the Grand Camp that flew miles away. Here are some pieces of shrapnel, and you'll see they called it a Texas City Raindrop 4/16/47. I am a chip from the Grand Camp ship. And here's a hard hat that was totally obliterated. It's hard to even tell it was a hard hat. Here you can see the smoke, and it was described as mushroom clouds after the explosion occurred, and the fires were giving off yellow smoke and orangish smoke. Pretty amazing. And you can see the sheer size of some of these ships and the destruction of the ships that were still left in port. Although the city was destroyed and many lives were lost, they ended up rebuilding the city, and it actually was a focal point or a mechanism to which we today now know how to handle disasters better, and there's better disaster preparedness here in the United States because of this major disaster, and how to handle chemicals and chemical disasters, and how to, instead of being reactive, start being proactive, how to keep an event like this from happening again. It's just a shame something like this had to happen for the country to learn their lesson. So we learned a little bit more about the Texas City disaster. Let's go out into the wild, so to speak, outside the museum here, and go visit the sites where they have memorials and where there's actually a propeller and an anchor, or two anchors, actually sitting out from these ships that they built memorials around. And we'll visit the final resting place of the area where they buried the individuals they couldn't identify. Check out the size of that propeller, and this is the propeller from the SS Flyer, and we are a good mile plus from the port. So if I look that direction, on the other side of all those refineries and oil containers is the port. So this propeller flew all the way from over there and landed somewhere in this area. That's amazing. And to give you an idea about how big this propeller was, and the idea that this flew over a mile away from the explosion, gives you an idea about the sheer force of both those boats blowing up. They also have a little bit of information here on the Texas City disaster, which we learned about at the museum. But if you don't want to go to the museum, or maybe it's closed on a day you're here, you can come down here by the Texas City Dike Park and walk up and learn more about what happened and see this amazing propeller. Now, I'm going to go over and go see one of the anchors, and then I'm going to go to the final resting place, the memorial that was placed here for the victims that they weren't able to identify. And interesting enough, I have to ask myself, well, they had to know ammonium nitrate was dangerous by this time, especially after World War II, and even before that. I'm sure there's been other industrial accidents or accidents with it. Well, it turns out the Port of Houston actually banned it, but Texas City Port still allowed it to come through. And of course, we can see what the result of that was. And due to just some little bit of negligence, somebody potentially smoking, leaving a cigarette down in the hole, and then some bad decisions along the way led to the explosion that would not only toss this propeller all the way over here, but also this anchor from the Grand Camp. And we are still over a mile away. In fact, I believe I read this was 1.6 miles is how far this flew from the Grand Camp from that explosion. So imagine this giant anchor that has to be thousands of pounds. You can see how big it is relative to me, flying through the air and raining down here, and all of the shrapnel that they called Texas City rain from both the Grand Camp and the High Flyer, just raining down as hot metal and pieces of fire into the neighborhood and into this area here, burning a large portion of the city down. Now today they have this park here called Anchor Park, where you can come see the anchor. You can have a nice little playground area over here. There's lots of kids, lots of people here today. It's a Saturday, and the weather is quite beautiful in April, I will say. And you can learn a little bit more about this disaster here, as well as where we just came from at the propeller, and of course the museum. And they have information about it, that it was dedicated in 1962. Okay, from the anchor here, we're going to work our way over and check out this memorial and wrap up our trip to look at some of the sites associated with the Texas City disaster. Welcome to our last stop on this tour, and that's going to look at the Memorial Cemetery here at Texas City that was set up in 1947. And based on that date, it's probably obvious why this cemetery was set up here. But before I go too far into the cemetery, just on the outskirts of it here, they have another anchor, and this, I believe, is from the Grand Camp. And this is set up as a memorial to both the firefighters that you can see there behind it that lost their lives. Every single firefighter, the volunteer firefighter group, lost their lives when the explosion took place at the Grand Camp. And this is an anchor that flew somewhere about 1.6 miles away. And I believe this is the anchor that flew 1.6 miles. The other one we saw before was about a mile. And they set this up also as a memorial for the individuals who were the French officers and sailors on the Grand Camp that April 16th, 1947 day, who all lost their lives as well. Here's a bit about that memorial for the French officers and sailors that were here. I will say these are beautiful grounds, and we'll go ahead and head into the main part of the cemetery. Now, this isn't a cemetery like we often think of one. There's not a bunch of headstones here. This whole ground is the cemetery and hollow ground from what I can remember. And here's the in memoriam for the individuals who they know lost their lives. And don't forget, there's many that they still don't, or they were never able to identify. And here are the memorial services on June 22nd, 1947 that took place here at Memorial Park. And we'll walk over and take a look at the site where they buried the 63 individuals who they were never able to identify. And here is a statue that was built part of the commemoration of, is part of the remembrance of this disaster, and it just goes by grief. And here's about the Texas City Memorial Cemetery. And of course it has to start by talking about the disaster that took place here. So it says eventually 444 people were confirmed dead and an additional 143 were listed as missing, and there were 63 bodies that were never identified. And on June 22nd, they buried the unidentified bodies here in this memorial cemetery. So 63 people are buried here who they weren't sure who they were. You'll see it says, on the site within these oval walkways are buried the remains of the unidentified dead killed by the ship explosions on April 16th and 17th, 1947. And here is the actual memorial to the Texas City volunteer firemen who lost their lives battling that fire at the Grand Camp. And we can see an angel in front, and we can see grief in the background. A bit of a somber way to end this video and this tour through this area, and thank you all for coming with me to learn about this event and this disaster, and remembering the fact that it had an effect on so many people's lives and livelihoods. I hope you learned something new. I sure did. This is somewhere that's not too far from my home, but I didn't know a whole lot about. I started reading about it and wanted to share it with you all. And just the sheer size of what happened here with the Grand Camp and the high flyer exploding, throwing things like a propeller and these anchors way out. It's pretty fascinating to learn about, and such a tragic event, but one that helped lead us today to understand how to prevent these kinds of disasters. Okay, with that being said, thank you all again for joining me. If you all enjoyed this video, you all know what to do at this time. Give it a thumbs up, please leave comments, please subscribe to the video to keep up on my other adventures, and of course, take care everybody.